Hi, I'm Michael. I'm a small business owner, investor, a work in process improv artist, definitely neurotic and always looking for something new and interesting to entertain me. I'm a TV host and your host for what we call the Second Scene podcast. It's a Dweebs global production where you can go for free help, resume help, mental health help, anything you need. We have mentors around the world, over 500 of them. So please go to dweebsglobal.org. It's free. I swear it's free. So I'm here today with Clay Risen, senior political editor for the New York Times. He is also freelances for the who's who of respected news outlets. For his second scene, he has become an expert in all things whiskey, having written several books on the subject of whiskey. So it's too early in the day for me to have my whiskey. Otherwise I've been enjoying a glass right now.
Fair enough.
Where are you originally from?
I'm originally from Nashville. So grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, and only moved away for college. Never moved back, but I miss it a lot.
So you stayed once you left for college. You were.
Yeah, I mean, I moved around a lot after college, but never quite felt the pull to move back. Even as much as I love Nashville, I lived in Chicago for a while. I lived in different parts of Europe. I lived in New York, Washington, D.C. I just liked living in a really, really big cities. So Nashville, which is, Nashville now is a really big city, but when I was growing up, it was pretty small and insular, good place to grow up. I never really thought it would be a good place to maybe live out my young adulthood. So.
Did you keep some of your country roots?
I mean, I write about whiskey, so that's that's one thing. But no, I never had much of an accent. Nashville's far enough north where you get some people who have no accent at all, and some people have really thick accent.
Yeah, you can't hear it at all. I would never have guessed.
Sometimes when I'm back home, when I'm in Nashville or I'm talking to someone with an accent, it'll come back a little bit. But
I do that with anyone that I'm talking to that has an accent. I seem to take it on. I feel bad. I feel like
I think I'm one of those people. Yeah.
I do improv, and I can only do accents if my scene partner is doing an accent. Otherwise, I can't do it at all. If they change mine will change naturally right along with them. What's drawn you to the big cities?
That's a good question. I mean, I used to think that it was, so when I was a little kid, we spent about 2 years, we moved, my dad had business in Tokyo, and we moved to Tokyo, and, it was just, was and is just a mind-blowingly huge city. And I had a great time as a kid, just what I was at the right age, first and second grade, just kind of, really threw me for a loop. And coming back and living in Nashville, which again is a great place, but it wasn't the same experience. And so I think I always just had that bug to try to get back.
Okay. All right, great. Where are you coming out of right now?
I'm in Brooklyn. So at home in Bed-Stuy.
Oh, nice. I miss New York. I lived in the city for 11 years.
Oh, wow. Where are you? I assume you're not in, that looks like Hong Kong behind you?
No, I'm
not literally behind. Your screen is.
As I whack it, yes. I'm just outside of Washington, D.C.
Oh, okay. Oh, nice. I lived in D.C. for about 10 years. 10 years total. So.
Nice. We swapped with each other.
Yeah. I miss it. I like Washington a lot.
Yeah, I miss New York. I never thought I'd leave there. I thought I was there for good.
Yeah, I know the feeling.
So you were in first grade. You moved to Tokyo. Is that what you said? That's not the norm. What brought your family to Tokyo?
My dad was, my dad worked for a high-tech company, high-tech manufacturing company, and they had a lot of work in Asia, and this was early 80s, so phone calls, there was no telecommunications, so he had to travel a lot. Flights were expensive. So it got to a point where he was gone, altogether a couple months out of the year, and it just didn't make sense. So his company said, would you rather just be based in Tokyo and you could fly to Hong Kong or fly to wherever you have to go as a day trip or as an overnight trip instead of as a 2-week trip. And they said, we'll move you to Tokyo. So that's what happened. And he was there for a couple of years and wrapped up what he needed to do, and we came back.
What a crazy opportunity.
It really was. It really was. I mean, to go from, like a milieu where, let's just say, diversity was not, there wasn't much of it, to Tokyo, where I went to an international school, and I met a lot of the people who went there were children of business people or diplomats, but they were from all over the world. I was looking through my yearbook, from one of those years just the other day, and the number of kids, from Nigeria and from Saudi Arabia and from India and a lot of Japanese kids. So I just met this whole slew of people from countries I hadn't known existed. So, and got exposed to their cultures. And this is in the 80s, when in the United States, it's not like you'd ever encounter Nigerian food in Nashville, or, let alone meet somebody from Singapore.
So when did you first get into journalism?
Oh man, I think I wanted, as a kid, I kind of liked the idea. I always loved writing, and I always loved, the idea of journalism. It wasn't always what I wanted to do, but I loved the idea of it. And in college, I worked for the college newspaper, and did some freelance writing. I didn't really set out a career path for me. I mean, one of the tough things in journalism is you sort of have to do a lot of work on your own to figure out, where are you, what's going to be your entry point into this field. It's not like a lot of professions where, you go to a certain graduate school, and then from there you go to a job fair and you get a job, or where the paths are really clear. Journalism is, and I can't imagine what it's like today. It's probably a lot harder. But for me, even, so I wasn't doing that. And a lot of my friends were. I wanted to go teach. I wanted to maybe get a PhD. And so, I spent some years kind of in the young early 20s wilderness, having a good time, but, not really set on a career path. And it really wasn't until I got serious about applying for a PhD program, while also kind of working. I was living in New York at the time, and I was sort of working a bunch of what you might call kind of journalism adjacent jobs, like not really journalism, but kind of using the skills of journalism to, write reports, or, where I worked for a website for a while that helped people get, advised people on how to get a job with a high-end consulting firm or a high-end law firm, that sort of thing. And I wasn't especially happy with that. So I was constantly applying for new jobs, or applying for permanent jobs. And so I got a job offer from the New Republic, sort of almost out of the blue. I didn't expect that, given my background up to that point.
You just applied and closed your eyes?
Yeah, I just applied. I was just applying for everything. I probably applied for 50 or 60 jobs. And I got that one, and I had to make a decision, do I stick it out for grad school, or do I go ahead with this, which is, very clearly the first step along a pretty good first step into journalism.
Is that you decided you took it seriously at that point, and that was just a choice you made, and you put all your effort to go that direction?
I never really looked back, and I threw myself into this job, as into this career profession. I'm not sure what journalism is exactly. It's not quite a profession. It's a bit of a craft. It's a bit of a guild, but
Gotcha. So right now you're one of the head editors at the New York Times.
Well, yes. So I was an editor with the opinion section for about 10 years, and I ended up the last several years, I was the deputy OpEd editor. And then then I moved over. The way we do it is we have a politics section in the news side that starts up, a little bit before the election, and kind of it's a temporary desk. So it starts up and it gets a bunch of editors and a bunch of writers together, and they really focus on the election. And afterward, they split up. Everyone kind of goes back to other jobs, and then a couple years from now, we'll all get back together. So I'm actually currently moving into yet another job. So I've been writing obituaries for the last month or so, and that may end up being what I do for a while.
Was this a choice?
Yeah, I love writing obituaries. It's it's basically, we take a certain approach to obituaries, and other people do too at Washington Post and the Journal and some others, where we really almost just use someone's death as an opportunity to report out their life and tell an interesting story. Even though I've never gone and looked back on wishing I'd become an academic and tried to do anything about that, I do still love history. That was the field I was going to go into, and this job is a lot like that, where I sort of tell the history of a person's life and try to show the context in which that person lived, how they intersected with some aspect of usually American history. And yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Okay, you hear obituary,
and also
when you hear obituary, you just think somebody's writing about death all the time, but it sounds like it's a lot more intricate than that. It's a lot more.
Yeah, really, aside from saying that someone has died,
Mm-hmm.
I've never really. That's one line in, let's say it's 10 words out of 1,200.
Gotcha.
In an article.
When you worked as in the op-ed department, how was it choosing what stories to cover and what stories not to cover?
That was tough. It was nice in that we weren't, unlike the news side, where you cover the news. The news happens and you have to, there's very little that you can sort of say, well, we're not going to cover this. We're going to cover this, but not this. It's all the news that's fit to print. Whereas in op-ed, you really get to pick and choose and say, well, this is an important issue, either because it's sort of, it's obviously an important issue. Let's say it's Trump is impeached again. So that's something you need to talk about. But other things that are, maybe they're important because no one's talking about them. And then maybe there are things that people are talking about, but there's not really a lot to say about in terms of an op-ed. There might be a big news story without a lot of really interesting angles to it. So, a lot of our conversations and our judgment was built around that, around what are the stories, what are the opinions that really aren't getting exposure that we need to bring up, and then what are kind of the issues around which we want to kind of shape opinion. So everyone's talking about impeachment. How do we want to contribute to that? What are the voices? What are the points of view that we think can really add to that conversation?
Right. Would you have somebody with the opinion of the election being rigged even do an op-ed for the New York Times?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I can't speak for the people who are in the office now, my successors or my previous former colleagues. But I know if I were in that job, office, I wouldn't do that. I mean, that's the other tough question about running an op-ed page is, what are the acceptable limits of, let's say, of discourse, of opinionating on the page, and that's always a question, right? But it's the last 4 years have made it a very difficult conversation to have, because things that up until 4 or 5 years ago were considered really fringe, are now considered are now believed by tens of millions of people. So if you use the standards that you used to use, if we did, we'd have to talk about QAnon I mean, we'd have to run a pro QAnon piece because the standards of before were, what's roughly mainstream opinion, kind of the kind of boundaries of what we can, and anything conspiracy theories would always be outside of that. And now all of a sudden they're numerically in the mainstream, and yet we have to maybe readjust our standards. So I know that's a constant sort of frame of conversation in OpEd. It was when I was there, and I'm sure they're still kind of trying to work through that.
Yeah, I can't imagine how difficult it's become, because what's considered center, if you're on the right, you think that's like insanely far left. Like it's hard to keep that balance, or even to give people a voice, like how to choose who to give the voice to. Yeah, it's
we don't want to be thought of as, we don't think of ourselves as a liberal paper. We report the news objectively, and we don't want people to think of us that way. We really want to be appealing to readers of the Wall Street Journal and National Review and all that. And what we've found is, we all of a sudden, obviously we still want people like that, but we don't necessarily want to run coverage that appeal. The things that we would have to do in order to win over viewers of Newsmax or OAN, well, that's not what we are going to do. I mean, that's just not. They're peddling lies. So, but then that also contradicts our previous goal of trying to appeal to a broad swath of the numerical, let's say the median of American readers. So we've had to adjust what that means too, where our standard of being, the truth above all else, and being, very much about kind of telling things as it is itself a partisan position, and that's a very unfortunate and difficult place to be.
right. Yeah, I've always feared that I'd open the New York Times one day and I would see a pro QAnon story or a pro election fraud story in that way, and then I'd be like, oh well. Now I guess we've jumped the shark, or there's gotta be another term for that, but we haven't gotten there.
I mean, yeah, when we have to, no, and when we say, look, the president is lying because there's no conspiracy, there's no mass voter fraud. That's just true, but a huge number of people see that and think that it's a far left statement to make.
So do you enjoy the editing or the writing?
I'd like to say I enjoy both equally. I probably enjoy writing a little more, but also I just came off of about 10 years of just editing, and writing on the side, and doing a variety of freelancing, but not having my job was editing. And so now I'm in a job where it's all writing. That's all I do, and the dew is not yet off the lily in that regard. I may, 6 months from now, you should ask me the same question, I may tell you, God, I just want to get out of here, I just want to go back to editing. But right now it's a lot of fun and new and interesting. So right now I'm really jazzing on the writing gig.
That's lucky you got to change it up like that, and in the same field.
Yeah, I had honestly thought for a while that I was basically going to be an editor for the rest of my life, and not that there's nothing wrong with that. I just figured that was sort of where my I had plowed that furrow pretty deeply. I figured that's where I'll be. So to have this opportunity to now write full time is, it's a lot of fun. It's one of the great things about journalism is that there are a lot of opportunities to do different things within the field. So I know people who, they started off as print journalists, maybe they started off as reporters, they became editors. At a certain point, they became web editors. Now they do video production. And all of these are things, that skill sets that they pick up on the job, because the job is full of other people doing these things, and lots of opportunities to learn as you go along. And so, that's a lot of fun. And then there are people who, they've done all that and then they go back to writing, or they move into script writing. They kind of leave the field to some extent and go do something else, but they have all these skills that make it very easy to transition into something yet again.
Right, right.
So yeah, lots of chances.
A lot of avenues to go down. So you've chosen to write about whiskey.
Yeah, along the way, along with writing about all kinds of other things and editing. Writing about whiskey.
Right. You've written a handful of books. The Crowded Hour, Theodore Roosevelt, The Rough Riders.
Yeah. So I write. Actually, kind of have two tracks to my book writing. I've got books that I write about history. I write American history books. So I wrote a book on the Civil Rights Act. Wrote a book about the Rough Riders. Wrote a book about the week that Martin Luther King was assassinated. And then separate from that, I also write books and newspaper articles and other things about whiskey. So I've written 3 books about whiskey as well, and actually have another one coming out this fall. So,
sounds like a dare a
turning
friend
them out
would make
there.
you one night when you were out drinking. I dare you to write a bunch of books about.
Yeah, it wasn't. Yeah, I would say that's totally off base.
What got you into what motivated you to write your first book about whiskey? What brought you there?
I had been writing articles, variety of for the New York Times, for variety of websites, writing about whiskey for a couple of years, and someone approached me, said, "Hey, I've got an idea for a book." This was back when whiskey was not nearly as big a world as it is now, but it was obviously moving in that direction. And so this guy said, we'd like to put together a book, and I'm a sort of graphic designer and can package a book, and would you want to do a book that reviews all the American whiskey that's out there? So that part was very much like a dare. Like, I dare you to taste every whiskey made in America and write about it. So I said, yeah, sure, why not? So we made the first book, which is called American Whiskey, Bourbon, and Rye. And that has actually done that's sold over 100,000 copies. That book is just continues to sell. We did a second edition that continues to sell. And then that guy who approached me, George Scott, we continue to work together. And so we did another book on single malt Scotch whiskey together. And now we're working on a book about rye whiskey. And that'll be out next year, hopefully, knock on wood.
I feel like it's like the Super Size Me documentary where he had his doctors check on him throughout his writing. Do you get liver checks every once in a while? And
I try to keep healthy. Try not to do too much extracurricular tasting, let's say, really focused on the project. I have a tasting panel that I work with. So, people in the industry, other journalists, some people who work on the sales side, retailing, people just know whiskey. And so we do our tastings once a week, and virtually these days. But it's a lot of fun. It's you're trying to make it a social activity as much as possible.
Yeah, I want to come to one of those parties. I mean, work events.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know that much about whiskey myself. I enjoy a glass of whiskey, but there's so many different types of whiskey. What makes them a whiskey? There's bourbon, there's corn, there's malt, rye whiskey, rye malt, wheat. But what makes them a whiskey?
Yeah. So they've got to be made with grain, right? So it's got to be corn, wheat, barley, whatever. It's got to be fermented. So you basically make beer, right? And then you distill it. And so that strips out all the color and a lot of the beeriness, and you just get the alcohol. And then it has to be aged. So it sits in a barrel, and that's where it gets the color, a lot of the flavor. And that's what makes it whiskey. And then what makes the different types is, it's partly about the recipe, what grains go into it. It's where it's made. So Scotch has to be made in Scotland. Bourbon has to be made in the United States. but each country has its own traditions and its own styles. So it's not like bourbon and Scotch, the only thing that separates them is their nationality. It's also all kinds of history and culture and traditions and technology that go into making one very different from the other.
Are there, I guess there's a lot of similarities between the way they make them in the different countries, but enough of a difference. Can you taste the difference? Would you be able to name?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
oh yeah, definitely. I mean, you can taste the difference because of the grain that's used. You can taste the difference because of a lot of the impact of all these different sort of techniques that go into making it end up producing a different product than you might get in, even though the basic process is the same wherever you are. But it's part of what's wonderful about whiskey is the basic rules are the same, and yet little tweaks and little differences add up to very big differences in the results.
Is it like wine where each year tastes slightly different than the previous year, or is it more consistent?
Some it's a little more consistent. Partly because that's how they want it. So there just isn't a tradition of annual releases. It's starting to change a little bit. You're seeing a little bit more of people making annual releases. It's good marketing. It's to be able to say year after year, well, you've got to buy this bottle this year because it's different from the bottle last year. And that's pretty smart. So you see more distilleries are starting to try to say, well, we did it a little different this year versus last year. But it's not really it sort of has to be imposed, because unlike with wine, it's really that comes out of the harvest tradition, right? It's you harvest the grapes, you make the wine, you age it, and then you sell it, and that's all in one component. But with whiskey, you're working with grain, and yeah, grain is harvested at certain times, but it's dry, it's stable. You can go buy corn whenever you want. And so, they're making whiskey all the time. It's not really a seasonal thing. So you really have to then introduce differences in order to get that marketing angle.
Are you able to recommend different whiskeys depending on a person's personality or their taste? Or
Yeah, I mean, what do you like? What
I'm
kind
a
of
red wine drinker normally. Normally, I'm a Pinot Noir.
okay. I mean, I find that people who like red wine, particularly if you like Pinot, really robust bourbon is often a good thing to go with. So actually, Knob Creek that's a really good choice. Uh, Something that's got a lot of body to it. Whiskey, a lot of the terms are the same. You talk about wine that has body. You talk about wine textures, uh, flavor profile. Or there's a lot of Scotch that they'll age it in a barrel, and then they'll put it into another barrel that used to hold wine, and they'll age it a little longer to get some wine qualities to it. So I would recommend one of those. There's some really, Macallan is the really famous single malt Scotch that's finished in sherry barrels. But there are a lot of other ones like that, and that often has a nice complements, let's say, a wine-friendly palate really well.
Okay. I know you've written a book just about the bottles. What's the history with whiskey bottles?
Well, I mean, that was very much about just what can you say about, what does the bottle tell you about the brand and about the whiskey? In that case, it was truly historic whiskey that really wasn't most of it I hadn't tasted, because these are either bottles there are only 5 of them in the world, or you could get one, but it's a $500,000 to buy a bottle. So it's really more about using the bottle to talk about the brand and about the history and about the to some extent about the whiskey, but not really about what I think about the whiskey or giving it kind of review, because I honestly have no idea what some of that stuff tastes like, except that for one reason or another, these are revered bottles.
Okay, that's wild. There's that many whiskeys around the world that you haven't managed to have a taste of at least most of them.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, there are, yeah, thousands and thousands, and especially in Scotland, you just have such a rich and deep history of distilling that you have whiskey that, even today, might have been bottled 50 years ago, but even today, people are, so eager to get their hands on, even though there might only be 3 or 4 bottles in the world. So it's, you can talk about that. That's fascinating to me. What makes this bottle that was bottled in, when my father was a child, what makes it so revered? Um, you know, that to me is really interesting.
Is there a big difference in quality from, I guess, more expensive brands of whiskey or?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of hype, and there's certain bottles that I think are probably overhyped. There's kind of a price bubble right now in bourbon, I think, where people are just paying a lot more money than they should for certain whiskeys. On the other hand, I think with Scotch, the price the price tracks quality pretty closely, I think. So, $1,000 bottle is going to taste. I mean, you can never say this for sure, but I mean, I'd be willing to say $1,000 bottle is going to taste 10 times better than $100 bottle, more or less. Not in every case, but it's closer with Scotch. Bourbon, I don't think that's true. There are a lot of $1,000 bottles out there that are no better than $100 bottle. They just have a lot of hype around them. But Scotch definitely these days, a bottle of 30-year-old, which is about $900,000. If you taste it, that is just sublime,
You skipped out.
beautiful
What was
whiskey.
the name? You skipped out for a second. What was that?
Oh, sorry, it was the Balvenie,
Okay.
and they make a 30-year-old bottle expression that is just phenomenal and worth every penny. I've never bought it, but it's worth every penny.
You've had a sip of it.
I've had a sip of it on a few occasions.
You've had
It is
$10,000
exactly,
sips. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
So it's different than wine, but all the aging takes place in the barrel or in the casks, right?
Yeah, once you take it out, it over a long period of time, subtle changes will occur. But once it goes into a bottle, and if you keep it out of the sunlight, if you keep it in pretty constant temperatures, it's not really going to change. The alcohol content is so high that you won't get a lot of variety. You certainly don't benefit from keeping it around. Yeah, so in that regard, it's very much unlike wine. And once you move it, even put it in a steel container, it's not going to age.
Okay. I'm into mixed martial arts. Is Conor McGregor's proper one any good or?
It's I was really skeptical, but it's pretty good. I won't say it's one of my favorites, but I've been properly impressed with it.
Okay.
Just in terms of there was a lot of hype around it. Celebrity whiskeys tend not to be very good. There are a lot of them these days, a lot of celebrity whiskeys, but I think his is pretty good. The Metallica whiskey is it's called Blackened. That's really good. And yeah, I that's one of the few celebrity whiskeys that I'll get behind. Actually, Peyton Manning has a whiskey, and it is really good. That's stuff that I would definitely recommend.
Well, if there's one, just to bring the interview to a close, I want your whole reputation to ride on this. What's one affordable whiskey that we should go try that you really highly recommend? One of your favorites.
All right, one of my favorites. I will always stand by this. If you can find a whiskey called Old Grandad 114, and that means it's 114 proof or 57% alcohol. It's a really powerful whiskey, but it is very affordable. It's about $30 for a bottle, and it for a long time was sort of sailing under the radar a little bit. But I think people are starting to. I've seen prices start to go up, and I'm a little worried that my old granddad is going to start to disappear from the value shelf. It's going to start to migrate. Pretty soon, it's going to be behind the glass case. I've seen it happen with other whiskeys that I've loved and will no longer pay for on principle. So while you can, go get that old granddad 114.
Okay, I'm on it. I'll know if I should believe everything else after I have that that one sip.
There you go. There you go.
So well,
I will let that ride.
well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed speaking
Hey,
to you for the last hour. So
yeah, no, thanks for having me. This is a lot of fun.
well,
Always happy to talk.
It's been Clay Risen. You can check out Clay Risen's books at clayrisen.com, CLAYRISEN.com. And check out his latest books on whiskey and American history. Also, please check out dweebsglobal.org, where they offer free mentorships for people from mental health to resume writing. And it's completely free, and we have people around the world ready to help. So dweebsglobal.org.